It's time again for The Insiders with Chuck Chvala and Scott Jensen, sponsored by the Wisconsin Counties Association and the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership.
Hi, I'm Chuck Chvala, former Senate Majority Leader.
And I'm Scott Jensen, former Assembly Speaker.
We're the Insiders. So, Scott, boy, wouldn't it have been great to have a $7 billion surplus to do something with back in our day? Think of the things we could have done. What's your take on what's going to happen here, and what are the politics as well as the substantive policy things you see coming up?
Well, as I recall, Chuck, we did have a huge surplus when you and I were there, and we couldn't agree on what to do with it. And we spent 100 days tramping around the state trying to convince everyone to take my position or to take your position. In the end, what we did was we decided, well, there's enough money here that both of us can win. You got senior care and I got what was then the largest tax cut in the history of the state. I think that is actually a little less likely to occur here. I mean, most people would say, well, wouldn't you try to find a position in between? That's actually not always the easiest way to negotiate, is to negotiate all the details and find something in between. It is easier to do what we did, which was, okay, you get your number one priority, I get my number one priority, we get the heck out of here. We go back to the voters and we brag about both of those items. But I don't know that that's going to happen. It's surely not going to happen in 2023. And I think it is unlikely in the short session in 2024 to happen. And one of the reasons is that only the legislature is on the ballot. The governor's not on the ballot. If the governor were on the ballot in 24 and the legislature were on the ballot, they would both be looking at that pot of money and saying, oh, this is a chance to make our constituents really happy. We should find a way to agree on something. But there's really no incentive other than good management of the state for the governor to agree with Republicans on what to do with that surplus. He's enjoying campaigning out there on creating essentially a new entitlement in Wisconsin for the state to now provide parents with greater assistance for childcare. Republicans are out there saying, well, no, we all promised a tax cut. You vetoed it. We need to deliver this tax cut before the next election. I'm not sure I see them ever quite getting on the same page for that, because only one of them faces the electorate in 2024.
Well, I think Scott's analysis here is pretty good, except let me give you a couple of differences. One is, and probably the most important, is that there's a very good chance that you're going to see an entirely different map for both the Senate and Assembly to run in. If that's the case, why would the governor let the Republicans determine how any of that money is going to be spent, or even half of it's going to be spent, if he has a very good chance of having both houses in control of the Democrats after the next election? And Scott is absolutely right. I agree with him 100%. The governor is not up for election. That's why it is not incumbent upon the governor to do anything right now. In fact, he can accomplish his policy objectives and what he believes and what I believe are the objectives of the people of Wisconsin by waiting. And one of those things is a child care policy that actually engages more women in the workforce, which is essential because we're really short on workers in Wisconsin, as we are across the country. For the last 3 months or 4 months, we have actually had more than 3 million people employed in Wisconsin, which has never been the case before. We've got high employment, but we can do even better with workforce participation by women. But that is only going to happen if the expenses of childcare are somehow helped by the government. And so, bottom line is, we will have to spend money to make money. We're going to have to help with childcare in order to get more women into the workforce. And I think that's a winning message for the governor and for legislators from the Democratic side to run on. So I think that this is going to be a situation where the extremes, the Republicans aren't really very willing to compromise. There might be a property tax relief program or something for K-12 education and childcare combined with some taxing that could be done. They're not inclined to compromise. I don't think that they see that as it's not their thing for whatever reason. I guess we know the reasons. So I think I agree with Scott. It won't happen. I think for many of the same reasons that Scott's saying, but I think what you're going to see is a really interesting public policy debate following the next election.
Well, I think you're right that the child care proposals are popular at a time when people are struggling. It's like That's when they're always willing to have more government, right? Is when I can't afford to pay for this. Gee, more government might be a good idea. Well, not really. But anyways, that's when people say that they're for it. But I would point out the Republican tax cuts are popular, and not necessarily just the lowering of the bracket for one of the lower brackets that they're talking about, but that eliminating taxes for people who are retired, and ending income taxes for retirement income is something that I know I've tested over the last 20 years. I chiseled away at it when I was in the legislature. It is something that is important to people. And we lose a lot of our senior citizens in this state to places that are warmer and they have lower or no taxes on their income. In fact, the teachers union used to publicize in its own newsletter for its retirees what states have no income taxes on retirement income. They were almost helping send people to other places. So I think that that is a popular idea, trying to keep people here at home in Wisconsin by saying, you've lived your life here, you've retired here, we want you to stay here. We want grandma and grandpa to be by the grandkids, not in Florida. And so I think that's a very popular idea. But again, I don't think there's enough pressure on both sides to get to an answer. Only one side has pressure, and it's the pressure that Chuck suggested is a maybe on a new legislative map. And I think it's a certainty because Janet Protasewicz promised it. So I'm sure she's going to deliver on that.
God, he's got so many ways that he wants me to take the bait. Let me just take one portion of the bait here. When we're starting to talk about why people leave the state, let's be clear. If we have this conversation in January, everybody knows the reason that people leave the state. It's the weather. This has nothing to do with a few dollars in taxes that may or may not be there. It has to do with the weather. And sure, once they're deciding to leave, that may be it. But I'll tell you what, Montana doesn't have a big income tax where my son lives. They're not moving to Montana because the weather ain't so good in Montana. In fact, my son noted for me today, 13 degrees over there in Big Sky and Bozeman. So I think that what's going on here is we're going to see, I think, the ascendancy of issues that make a difference to people. Women cannot go and work at $12 or $15 an hour when they have to pay $7 an hour for childcare. If we want women in the workforce, we're going to have to deal with it. I think that mantra will be repeated by the governor, and I think you're going to see that pass in the next session of the legislature with at least one house controlled by Democrats. That's my prediction.
You're going to be wrong on that.
We'll see you next
week.
You've been listening to The Insiders with Chuck Chvala and Scott Jensen, sponsored by the Wisconsin Counties Association and the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership.